The sunset painted the mountains of Colorado in 1884 in deep crimson and burnt orange. A dry wind dragged pebbles across the cracked earth, and a thin road stretched toward the horizon like a fragile promise. Margaret walked slowly, her son Eddie pressed close to her side, his small hands gripping her dark coat, worn thin and stained by dust and rain. Every step across stone and dead grass sent pain through her legs and back, but turning back was no longer possible. The past had taken everything. Forward was the only choice left. She narrowed her eyes against the sun. Dust scratched at her lashes, yet her heart beat louder than the pain. Children cried in the dark, but Eddie stayed silent, held still by fear and trust in equal measure. And then, through the haze, she saw smoke, a ranch on a low hill, solid, standing. A man appeared on the porch, tall, broad-shouldered, weathered by wind and sun. His gaze was sharp, but not cruel. In that moment, Margaret did not know if this place meant refuge or risk, only that everything was about to change. If you're drawn to frontier stories of hardship, quiet courage, and families found against all odds, consider subscribing to Dust and Devotion Tales. Some journeys are worth walking together. The plains of Colorado stretched without mercy, rolling outward until sky and earth blurred together beneath the sun. Heat rose from the ground in wavering sheets, bending the air and dulling distance, turning every step into an effort against an unseen weight. Margaret moved forward steadily, her pace slow but deliberate, as though stopping would allow the land itself to claim her. Eddie stayed close against her side, his small frame pressed into her coat, drawing warmth where little remained. His body trembled, not from complaint, but from exhaustion layered too deeply to be voiced. Her boots had begun to fail her days ago. The soles were thin, the leather cracked, each uneven stone biting through with sharp insistence. Blisters burned with every step, but she did not slow. The bag slung over her shoulder pulled awkwardly, its strap frayed and stretched, threatening to give way entirely. She adjusted it when she could, shifting its weight without stopping, conserving what little strength she had left. Rest felt dangerous out here, as though the moment she allowed herself to pause, the road would swallow her whole. The wind was relentless. It tore loose strands of her hair and flung them across her face, coating her skin in dust that clung to sweat and dried into grit. Her eyes stung constantly, lashes heavy with dirt, but she kept them narrowed against the glare, scanning the horizon for any change in the land. The wind carried sounds that refused to stay still. A fence creaked somewhere far off, wood protesting against age and neglect. Hoofbeats echoed briefly and then vanished, leaving behind uncertainty rather than reassurance. Dry brush whispered and rattled, mimicking movement where none existed. Every sound demanded attention. Every shadow became a question. Margaret's body stayed tense, ready to shift, to turn, to shield. She adjusted her posture instinctively, keeping Eddie slightly behind her when the wind shifted, placing herself between him and whatever might appear from the open land. Her awareness never softened. It sharpened instead, honed by fear and responsibility into something focused and precise. Her thoughts came in fragments, breaking apart under the strain of heat and fatigue. Fear surfaced without warning, sudden and sharp, followed by the heavy ache of doubt. There were moments when tears pressed close, when the effort of holding herself together felt unbearable. But the sensation never lasted. It was replaced quickly by resolve, by the unyielding knowledge that stopping was not an option. Eddie depended on motion, on endurance, on her refusal to give in to the weight pressing down from every direction. She felt the land watching her, not with intent, but with indifference. The plains offered no comfort and no judgment. They simply existed, vast and unmoved, daring her to cross them. Margaret leaned into that challenge, drawing strength from the act of continuing. Her muscles ached, her back stiffened, and her breath came shallow, but she stayed upright. She stayed moving. The sun lowered slowly, its position marked by lengthening shadows that stretched across the ground like dark fingers. With the change came a subtle shift in temperature. Heat eased just enough to reveal the chill beneath, reminding her how exposed they truly were. Eddie pressed closer as the warmth faded, his head resting briefly against her side before lifting again, alert despite his fatigue. Margaret kept her gaze forward. She measured distance not in miles but in moments, focusing on the next rise, the next bend, the next stretch of ground that might offer something different. Hope was dangerous when allowed too much space, but she let herself feel it in controlled pieces, just enough to continue. Somewhere ahead, the road had to lead to something other than open land and silence. As dusk gathered strength, the sky deepened in color, and the plains grew quieter. Margaret welcomed the fading light, not for rest, but for the promise that night might conceal them where day left them exposed. She adjusted her grip on Eddie, straightened her shoulders, and continued on, her resolve rooted not in certainty, but in the simple, stubborn act of moving forward. The settlement revealed itself slowly, a scattering of weathered buildings crouched low against the open land. It felt temporary, as though it might be dismantled and vanish overnight, leaving no trace behind. People appeared in fragments rather than groups, figures in worn clothing who paused just long enough to observe before moving on. Their attention lingered. Every step Margaret took seemed to be measured, weighed, and judged by highs sharpened through hard years and harder choices. She adjusted her pace to shield Eddie from their scrutiny, positioning her body between him and the watching faces. His legs trembled with fatigue, and she compensated without stopping, lifting him slightly when his steps faltered, hiding his weakness as best she could. Her hands shook from strain and hunger, but she kept them steady, forcing control into every movement. In a place like this, need was visible, and visibility invited danger. The air carried unfamiliar smells of smoke, damp wood, and unwashed clothes. Rough laughter drifted from somewhere beyond the buildings, followed by silence that felt deliberate. Margaret stayed alert, her senses stretched thin, reading the settlement through instinct rather than reason. She did not trust the quiet. She did not trust the way conversations paused when she passed. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a biting wind that cut through cloth and skin alike. With no door to close behind them, she found shelter beneath an old wooden awning at the edge of the settlement. Its supports groaned and shifted as the wind pressed against them, branches scraping and tapping against the boards in uneven rhythm. The ground beneath was cold and unforgiving, but it offered enough cover to disappear from view. Margaret gathered Eddie close, arranging her coat around him, using her own body to block the worst of the cold. Darkness settled in thick layers, erasing the settlement's shape until only sound remained. In that quiet, the weight of responsibility pressed down harder than fatigue. She felt alone in a way that had nothing to do with distance, carrying not only her own fear, but her son's future with every breath she took. She held him so he would not feel the tremor in her chest, controlling her breathing, slowing her pulse through sheer will. Eddie slept lightly, his trust complete, his survival bound entirely to her choices. Her heart beat fast and uneven, each thud echoing with questions she refused to answer aloud. The night offered no comfort, only time to think. Somewhere beyond the settlement, beyond the watching eyes and the brittle wind, safety had to exist. She listened to the quiet voice inside her that urged movement, persistence, and learning. This land demanded adaptation. It demanded strength sharpened through hardship. Margaret understood that remaining still was as dangerous as moving blindly. When the wind eased and the sky began to pale, she was already preparing herself to go on, knowing that survival here required forward motion and an unbroken will. Smoke appeared first, a thin thread rising against the darkening sky, so faint it might have been imagined. Margaret slowed without meaning to, her attention narrowing until the rest of the land seemed to fall away. The road angled upward toward a low hill, and there, set solidly against the open plains, stood a ranch house that did not look temporary or fragile. It was built to remain. Wood darkened by weather, a roof that had held through many seasons, light gathering behind its windows as evening settled. As they drew closer, the shape of the place became clearer. A rough wooden fence outlined the land, its posts uneven but sturdy. A small herd of cattle moved lazily within its bounds, their presence steady and untroubled. The smoke of smoke grew stronger, carrying warmth with it, carrying the promise of fire and shelter. The wind seemed to soften near the hill, as though the land itself bent slightly around the house. A man stood on the porch, still and upright, his figure framed by the doorway behind him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture balanced and grounded, like someone accustomed to open space and long hours of work. His hands rested easily at his sides, thick and worn, marked by sun and labor rather than violence. He watched without haste, his gaze attentive but measured, taking in the sight of Margaret and the child beside her without judgment or alarm. Margaret felt the tension in her body tighten rather than release. Safety was never given freely on the frontier. It had to be tested, weighed, and chosen. She adjusted her hold on Eddie, guiding him forward as they crossed the final stretch of open ground. Gravel shifted beneath her boots, the sound loud in the quiet, but nothing in the man's stance changed. He did not retreat, and he did not advance. The stillness felt deliberate, a silent allowance rather than a challenge. Inside the fence line, the air changed. The smell of wood smoke blended with hay and earth, grounding and familiar. The house revealed itself as simple but cared for, a wide porch, clean boards, tools stored neatly against the wall. Inside, warmth gathered in layers. A solid wooden table stood at the center of the room, its surface scarred by use. 2 chairs were pushed in close. Shelves lined the walls, holding glass jars filled with preserved food, a few worn books set carefully among them. The hearth glowed steadily, firelight moving across stone and wood. Margaret felt it then, subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders lowered, her breathing slowed. The constant vigilance that had driven her forward across the plains loosened its grip, if only slightly. She guided Eddie closer to the heat, aware of how still he had become, how his body leaned instinctively toward warmth and light. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the world felt contained. Walls stood between them and the wind. Fire stood between them and the cold. The road no longer stretched endlessly ahead. In that quiet space, Margaret allowed herself a single steady breath, carrying relief without surrender, knowing rest had been offered, even if the future remained uncertain. Winter settled over the ranch with relentless weight. Snow gathered along the fences and roof lines, burying the land in white and muting every sound except the wind. It cut across the open ground without mercy, slipping through seams and coats and gloves, numbing fingers within minutes. Days shortened, light thinned, and the world seemed to exist only in shades of gray and pale blue. Work filled every hour that daylight allowed. Wood had to be split before dawn fully broke, each swing of the axe sending a dull ache through stiff shoulders. The animals needed tending regardless of weather, their breath rising in thick clouds as feed was carried across frozen ground. Water had to be checked constantly, ice broken and cleared before it could trap life beneath it. Pastures were watched carefully, tracks read in snow, signs measured and remembered. Margaret learned the rhythm quickly. Her hands hardened, skin roughening and cracking despite her efforts to protect it. The weight in her arms and back became familiar, less like pain and more like proof that she was still standing. She moved with purpose now, no longer hesitating before each task. The cold tested her endurance daily, but it also stripped away doubt. There was no room for hesitation in winter, no space for fear to linger once work began. They worked side by side, often without looking at one another. Their movements aligned naturally, one reaching for tools as the other finished a task, steps adjusting without thought. Trust formed quietly, built through repetition rather than promise. A glance was enough to understand what needed doing next. A pause carried meaning. Silence became efficient, almost necessary, conserving warmth and energy. Margaret began to notice the land the way he did. She learned to read the sky, to recognize the warning signs carried in clouds and shifting wind. She watched how the animals moved before a storm, how they huddled and turned their bodies against the cold. Tools felt less foreign in her hands. The weight of responsibility settled into her bones, heavy but grounding. Inside the house, warmth gathered slowly around the fire each evening. Snow melted from boots by the door, leaving dark patches on the floor. Simple meals carried more meaning than they once had. Rest came in short stretches, never fully deep, but enough to restore strength for the next day. Care revealed itself in small, deliberate ways. Extra wood stacked closer to the door, blankets placed where they would be needed before night fully set in. A shared understanding that exhaustion was not weakness, only a signal to move carefully. What grew between them did not demand attention. It existed in patience, in steady presence, in the quiet decision to endure together through the long, unyielding winter. Spring arrived without ceremony, easing its way into the land as the last traces of snow withdrew from the fields and shadows. The ground softened beneath foot, releasing the scent of damp earth and new grass. Green spread slowly at first, then with confidence, covering the plains in quiet renewal. The ranch breathed again. Birds returned to the fence posts and roof lines, their movement bringing sound back into the mornings. The nearby streams swelled and moved with purpose, no longer trapped beneath ice. Life shifted with the season. Work remained constant, but it carried a different weight now. Tasks no longer felt like survival alone, but preparation for growth. The cattle grazed calmly, heads lowered, untroubled by the cold that had once ruled the land. Gates stood open longer. Hands moved without urgency, guided by habit rather than fear. Eddie claimed the yard as his own. He ran across the open ground with unguarded energy, stopping only when curiosity demanded it. Laughter replaced watchfulness in his movements. The tightness that once held him close to Margaret loosened, and she allowed it, even as she followed him with her eyes. His ease reshaped the space around them, turning the ranch from shelter into something resembling home. Margaret noticed changes in herself as well. Her posture eased, her breathing slowed. She worked with steadier hands, mending fences, sorting supplies, learning the quiet order of the place. The land no longer felt like an adversary. It felt demanding, but fair. Each task completed carried its own reward, small but satisfying. She watched the way he moved through his work, the care given to animals, the patience shown to the land itself. He noticed the same in her, though nothing was said. Their awareness of one another grew in these moments, built through observation rather than intention. They adjusted to each other's presence naturally, paths crossing and separating throughout the day without friction. Trust formed in the ordinary, in shared responsibility, in the confidence that what was started would be finished, that what was needed would be done. There was no declaration, no defining moment. Instead, attachment settled quietly, woven into routine and repetition. As days lengthened and light lingered into evening, the ranch held a new rhythm. It was shaped by care, by steady work, by the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. What they were becoming did not require naming. It existed in action, in consistency, in the simple choice to remain, building something lasting from the everyday moments they shared. Summer brought warmth and the plains shimmered with vibrant green. Life on the ranch settled into a steady rhythm, each day measured by the sun's rise and fall. Margaret moved among the chores with a quiet strength, tending to the house, organizing supplies, preparing meals with careful hands, each motion thoughtful and deliberate. James worked beside her, moving with economical precision, checking the cattle, mending fences, and managing the pastures. Eddie darted between them, small and lively, laughter and curiosity coloring his steps. The bond between the three had grown without words, formed in shared labor, trust, and silent understanding. Mornings began with the soft gold of sunrise spilling across the ranch, illuminating the dew on the grass and the dust still clinging to the wooden structures. Margaret paused sometimes to watch James guide the cattle to new grazing, noticing the way his body moved with quiet authority, each action careful but unhurried. She felt a calm she had not known in years, a sense of belonging that neither words nor promises could have created. Even the smallest gestures, the passing of a tool, a glance over the shoulder, a hand brushing a stray hair, spoke of connection deeper than conversation. Afternoons brought work that tested their endurance, splitting logs for firewood, repairing fences battered by storms, cleaning the stables, and ensuring the cattle were safe and fed. Margaret learned to read the subtle signs of the animals, understanding their moods and movements, while James guided her patiently. Each day her strength returned, her body remembering muscles she had not used in years, her mind finding calm in the routine. Trust had grown in the spaces between work and quiet moments, in small acts of care, in the rhythm of living together. Evenings unfolded slowly. Eddie would run to the porch, gathering sticks for a fire, while Margaret and James completed the day's final chores. The fire crackled, filling the house with warmth and a golden light that softened shadows in the corners. They moved around one another naturally, passing food, fetching blankets, adjusting chairs near the hearth. The silence between them was comfortable, full of understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of the family they had formed. Margaret watched Eddie's small face glowing in the firelight, feeling the weight of past fears melt away in the security of this new life. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, a figure appeared on the horizon, a faint reminder of the life she had left behind. Margaret's chest tightened for a moment, but then she felt the certainty of her choice. She did not turn back. She turned to James, standing steady and patient beside her, and felt the deep, unspoken promise between them. Love, she realized, was not merely feeling. It was the decision to stay, to protect, to nurture, and to build a life together. The days and nights that followed were filled with small wonders, shared laughter, quiet walks across the pastures, Eddie's delighted shrieks as he discovered a hidden bird's nest, the scent of warm bread drifting from the kitchen, the gentle glow of sunset painting the landscape in gold and crimson. The Colorado land had become safe, vibrant, and full of possibility. Their family had formed not from words, but from resilience, care, and the quiet certainty of presence. As Margaret watched James tuck Eddie into bed, she felt the weight of fear and loneliness finally lift. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and she allowed herself to breathe fully, knowing they were together. And for those who were drawn to stories of courage, resilience, and finding family where it seemed impossible, this life, this little ranch, and the bonds forged here are only the beginning. If you want to follow more stories of people discovering hope, love, and home against all odds, Dust and Devotion Tales is here to share each journey with you.